Everybody has a story. If it's about battling an addiction or a disease or going through some kind of terrible experience, then most people would probably think it's an interesting story, right? The more awful things get, the more audience is usually drawn in. And sometimes people think because a story is about something horrible, it must be a good story. Stories about small acts of kindness don't scream for our attention like those other stories. But what they can do is give us inspiration, and give us hope. So that's the kind of story I'm going to tell. Not because it'll make you cry or squirm in your seat, but because of small things. They matter. First, though, I need to tell you a little bit about myself. I come from a middle class family. I make good grades and I don't get into trouble. My parents are happily married to each other and we live in a pretty nice house. And nobody close to me has ever died. I'm really lucky and I know it. If you're cynical about it, you might think I'm very spoiled. Up until a couple months ago though, I'd have said you were wrong. For the most of my life, I never had empathy for other people's problems. I'd had sympathy, sure. One of my friends, his grandmother died and I felt bad about him. Another one of my friends, his dad was laid off and they lost their home. I also felt bad about them too. But I didn't feel any compulsion to try and help them or make them feel better at all. I didn't just offer a shoulder to cry on and say, "Hey, let's go to a movie." My treat, if anything, I sort of kept those friends at a distance because I was really uncomfortable being around their problems. I'd never had real problems, so I didn't have any empathy for those who did. I just couldn't relate at all. So yeah, I was very spoiled, but then this one thing happened to me. It was really small, but to me it was very important. I'm not going to say that it changed me in some huge way, because it didn't, but it made me realize that I wanted to be a better person. My big thing is, I love to read. That probably makes me a huge nerd, but I don't really care. I love books. Actual physical books that I can hold in my hand and feel the paper when I turn the pages. I would blow my allowance on books every month. Science fiction, fantasy, suspense, graphic novels, all kinds of stuff. And I read very fast too. I go through way more than what my allowance covers, so I borrow a lot of books from my school library. Well, anyway, my three favorite authors had new novels coming out the same month, in hardcover too. I only had enough allowance money to buy two of them, meaning that I was going to have to wait a whole 1 month for an extra book, in which I did not want to do at all. Now, normally, the school library wouldn't be a good source for instant gratification on a new book. They only buy stuff a couple times during the year. But one of these was an exception to me. It was the third volume of a really popular series. Tons of students were dying to get their hands on the book. So the library had placed a special order to get 2 copies on the day the book came out. And they were going to rush them through processing so they'd be ready to circulate when the school was over that afternoon. They weren't doing any advance hold, so if I wanted a copy, I had to be there as soon as the bell rang. My last class is one floor above the library and at the opposite end of the building. When the bell rang, I literally just ran, and I just ran through the hall and down to the stairs to the first floor. By the time I got to the library, I was totally out of breath. I charged in and went to the circulation counter, and there was another student that was in the process of checking out a copy of the book I wanted. I panicked a little, oh god, but the librarian knew what I was after, and she pointed out a small display table beside the window there. There was another copy of the book, and so I grabbed it, and I felt absolutely victorious. Thrilled out of my mind, I put the book down on the circulation desk and slid it towards the librarian as if I was claiming a winning lottery ticket. The librarian typed my name into the computer, squinted at the screen, and looked at me with a sad little frown and said, I'm afraid you have an overdue fine of 30 cents, sir." I stared at the librarian like she had a tree growing out of her head. An overdue fine? I brought back my last book a little late, but I thought for sure it was in grace period. Apparently, oh how wrong I was. The librarian smiled sympathetically and told me not to stress about it. I just needed to pay the fine before I checked everything else out, but I didn't have any money in me. I didn't usually need money at school, so I never bought any. I couldn't get the book at all, so I asked the librarian if she could just hold it for me for a day or two. But she said no. Too many people wanted it, and she couldn't let the book sit behind the counter. I just couldn't believe it. My plans were going blown to smithereens because of a 30-cent fine. Someone else was sure to get the book absolutely, and I'd have to wait days, weeks, or maybe months to even read it. Now I understand, in the grand cosmic scheme of things, this was a very minor deal. There were wars, sickness, and starvation, and here I was with a totally first world problem because of a book. And I knew it, but it's still very devastating to me, and I know that it's really a strong word for such a tiny thing, but that's how it really felt. And then behind me, a voice said, "Here." And a girl I didn't know leaned in front of me and put a quarter and a nickel into the circulation desk. I looked at the 2 coins and then at her. I had seen her face around the school, but I didn't know her. After a second or two, I stammered out a very surprised sounding, "Thanks." She shrugged and said it was no big deal. The librarian cleared my account. I thanked the girl again and left the library, even though I've been completely focused on the book and my big moment of triumph. Less than 2 minutes before, my mind kept replaying the image of her hand putting my overdue fine on the counter thousands of times. She had helped me. Something bad was happening to me, and a complete stranger had helped me. That thought stayed with me as I read the book over the next couple of evenings. But when I got my allowance next month, I went out and bought a copy of the book itself. Not to own the book for its own sake, but because of the book made me feel this way. It made me remember that sense of despair and how that despair was suddenly lifted away by a small kindness of a stranger. It didn't turn me into a crusading Samaritan or a social activist, but it did make me more sensitive to other people's problems, and it made me want to be the kind of person who does something to help when they can. It was a very small, simple kindness, and the girl responsible probably forgot about it before she went to bed that night. But even though it wasn't such a big deal to her, it really was a big deal to me, and I would never forget it.